Okay, great. Thank you, Deborah, for that talk, and I think it leads very nicely into this panel, which is a panel on the future of centers. And as we reflect on the 3 decades of DIMACS and the STC program, we wanted to take some time to more broadly discuss the role and values of centers in the scientific enterprise and in today's changing world. And we're very happy to have with us 5 distinguished panelists. 5 distinguished panelists. To explore this topic. And I want to say it was originally going to be 6. Vivek Shenoy at the University of Pennsylvania, who is a director of a current STC, unfortunately was unable to join us at the last minute, and he sends his regrets. So I will first introduce the panelists, then I'll give them some time to each share their perspectives about centers, their particular center in general, and then I'll ask them a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor to continue the conversation. So I'll do introductions across, and then I'll give you each a chance to talk. So David Banks is at Duke University, where he is the director of the Statistical and Applied Mathematical Sciences Institute, known as SAMPSI, and the professor of the Practice in Statistical Science. Deborah Estrin, who we just heard from, is the Robert V. Tishman 37 professor at Cornell Tech and in the Computer Science Department at Cornell University. And she currently serves as the Associate Dean for Impact at Cornell Tech. She was, as we heard previously, the founding director of the NSF-STC for Embedded Network Sensing at UCLA. I always knew Deborah was a genius. It became official last year when she became named a MacArthur Fellow. Lou Gross is at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where he is the director of the National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis, NIMBIOS, and the Alvin and Sally Beeman Distinguished Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and Mathematics. And Gregors Rempala is Professor of Mathematics at the Ohio State University. He served as interim director of MBI, the Mathematical Biosciences Institute, in 2016 and 17. And Jeanette Wing is at Columbia University, where she is the Avanesians Director of the Data Science Institute and Professor of Computer Science. And not only is she a director now of the Data Science Institute, but from 2007 to 2010, she served as the Assistant Director of SISE at NSF, the Computer Information Science and Engineering Directorate, and so she can also give us some perspective from the funder side of these centers. So with that, I will turn it over to David to give us a few remarks.
Well, my sense is that there's a rich ecology of research centers, and they should not be duplicative. They should be as different as possible and try and cover as many bases as possible. I will also add that there are many, many different components to a research center. It's not that they're all trying to just advance research. They do many different things.
Deborah, you want to add anything just now? Or okay, so Lou.
I think there's some slides, okay. So we'll see if they come up. So I'm the director, actually founding director, I've been doing it a while, of the National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis, which is not an STC, nor is it an ERC, an Engineering Research Center, nor is it a math institute. It is a biological directorate synthesis center designed to enhance the connection between mathematics and, broadly speaking, the life sciences, not direct human health because it's NSF. We've existed since 2008 as an NSF center. It's 10 years and out, only we're in year 12, so we expanded it a little bit. Obviously, we have many of the same activities that have gone on here at DIMACS. In fact, we've collaborated with DIMACS on a number of workshops and educational activities. One of the unique things about the synthesis centers is an emphasis on what we call working groups. This grew out of the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, which was the first one created about 22 years ago, I think. The emphasis there is on creating dream teams of people who ideally would come together several times over the space of a couple of years and work on a themed research project that they could not do at their own institution and that requires a kind of infrastructure that a center can provide to enable that research to be carried out. We've had 58 working groups. So that's one of the major differences. Another difference is the fact that we really did focus on communication in the sense that we had a full-time science communication expert, a PhD in science journalism, who really enhanced our opportunities to link to the broader public through lots of social media, as well as ensuring that we had connections to the really large group of folks around many, many biological sciences. There's lots of different subdisciplines within biology, in addition to the mathematics piece. And a second part, in addition to the scientific communications aspect, was a real focus on evaluating. We hired a full-time evaluator in-house. We produced evaluation reports in conjunction with the organizers of our activities. There's about 150 of them, and they're all posted online, which is also something that is not typically done in the evaluation community. The results from that included a fact that our advisory boards and the NSF review teams would ask us, here, we expect the following kinds of things to be going on. So one example of that is the data that's on this slide in your lower left, which was that at the beginning of this, on the vertical axis, is the percent of females in a working group. And that starts when we started in 2009 and then goes till this year. Each point is a working group. On the horizontal axis is the year. And we were charged to increase the percentage of females within our working groups in a consistent way. As you can see, the data indicates that we were successful at that metric. There were lots of other metrics, though, and we were very challenged to meet some of them. Could you switch to the next slide? Oh, thank you. Okay, we can drive it. Another challenge, of course, with all of these centers is sustainability. And our approach to sustainability has been to create offshoots that connect to our overall mission, but that in some sense have the capabilities of going off and creating their own enterprises. And so we've done that with several of them. One that I'll say something a little bit more about in the next slide is the National Institute for STEM Evaluation and Research that grew out of our emphasis on evaluation. Another one is a spatial analysis lab that grew out of the need at the university to have a central resource for remote sensing, for drone use, so that not every department has to have its own drone and its own camera system, as well as all of the associated software and tools to analyze the data. Another one, directed by my wonderful colleague Sergei Gavrilets, is DISOC. It's the Center for the Dynamics of Social Complexity. And we have a great group of folks at the university who are very interested in research that connects quantitative science to social science, and also to evolutionary ideas. So that's another outcome. And another one, Nina Pfefferman is here and is the director of our Math Modeling Consulting Center, which is an in-house group to help people use mathematical modeling across the university. So in the next slide, I just want to point out that this is one of the major products. I don't know that if any of the other centers here have had another center as a product. So this is the National Institute for STEM Evaluation and Research. It grew out of hiring one person who was our in-house evaluator, who actually completed her dissertation by doing network analyses of our activities, networks of connections. And this National Institute is now available. It is supported by the university. And I put up there a bunch of the current funding. They're currently working with about 20 different projects across the country, in addition to ones based at the University of Tennessee. So this is something that was totally unintended when we started, but has been one of our major products. I'll pass it on to Greg.
So let me just very briefly say a little bit about MBI and the history of that institute. As you already know, I was one of the people that were involved with MBI for the number of years, but for a period of time I was also, I had the opportunity to be the acting director of the institute as well. MBI is an interesting entity in my mind because in some sense it has grown out of another institute. So, you know, not that it grew out its own institute, but it actually was a child of an institute. It really grew out of the Institute for Mathematics and its Applications at the University of Minnesota. At the time when the director of that institute, Avner Friedman, sort of decided that it really makes sense to start talking about mathematics in the context of specifically new biological problems. And it was at the time when sort of all bunch of new technologies became available for interrogating, analyzing, better understanding biological data. So this was the dawn of the sequencing and various types of problems that were associated with specifically new ways in which biological data was collected. So all of a sudden, it turned out that new mathematical methods and sort of new approaches to understanding, better understanding how the biological systems worked were really needed. So one of the really important components of MBI was this notion that basically we have the two missions. So one of the missions was we really are interested in developing new mathematics for the consumption of biology. But on the other hand, we are also interested to see how these new methods and new ideas might potentially bring some new insights or perhaps new discoveries in biology. So this became one of the really main driving components of MBI. And this was largely accomplished by means of sort of standard workshops, meetings, various types of working groups, somewhat similar to what NIMBIOS was doing. I would like to say that NIMBIOS kind of, you know, took some of the components of the MBI playbook and applied them very well, which I think is great. But one of the things that MBI did, I think very successfully in many ways, was MBI really created this cohort of new scientists. So MBI very early on decided that it really wants to emphasize this notion of interdisciplinary scientist, mathematician who understands biology, biologist who is comfortable with various methods, ideas, and the notions of mathematics, and that somehow those types of scientists will be really crucial in helping build the community in mathematical biology. I think that this really applies in a broader sense, but in mathematical biology, it seemed like this was really an important component to be able to continue to build up the research in that general area, sort of quantitative research. So MBI has, by my count, had over 100 postdoctoral fellows that went through the institute since its inception. So the MBI started in September 2002, and since then there was over 100 postdoctoral fellows who for typically a period of 2 to 3 years stayed at MBI. So this is a very large cohort of individuals. Many of them went on to have very successful careers in various different areas of mathematical biology or outside. But the point, I guess, is that in some sense the Institute has really contributed to creating this new group, new generation of scientists, and we're very proud of this. And in some sense, I think this probably was the most important contribution of MBI so far to the area of mathematical biology in somewhat different ways. And even now, very often when we have these larger meetings of various societies interested in mathematical modeling in biology, there is typically a very robust group of both among the speakers and among the participants who sort of trace their origins to MBI.
Good afternoon. Am I on? Am I on? Okay. First of all, I'd like to wish Dimax a happy birthday. So happy birthday, Dimax. And I also wanted to say that we're actually quite thrilled that Rebecca left Dimax and joined Barnard. But I also want to say that your incoming director is phenomenal, David Pennock. I know him from when I was at Microsoft. So Dimax, you're in good hands. I wanted to first talk a little bit about the Data Science Institute at Columbia University because it's an unusual institute in the way it's set up. And then I wanted to say a few remarks about my time at the National Science Foundation and its, I guess, the why I guess I'm here. So first of all, the Data Science Institute at Columbia University is a university level and a university-wide institute. We have over 350 affiliated faculty coming from all 17 schools and colleges across the university. So it's truly interdisciplinary, and it's really about promoting collaborative, multidisciplinary research. Of course, data science, being a new emerging field, gets to kind of play whatever game it wants to play, but I think inherently, intellectually, because everyone has data and everyone can benefit from data analysis, that is why there's such interest across the entire university in participating in the Data Science Institute. So I'm going to just belabor this a little more and tell you my three-part mission statement, and then move on to NSF. So I have a three-part mission statement for the Data Science Institute. The first is, of course, advance the state of the art in data science, and the foundations of data science at Columbia are built on three strengths: computer science, statistics, and operations research. But we actually apply data science to all areas of application. The second part of the mission statement speaks to the breadth of the university, and that is to transform all fields, professions, and sectors through the application of data science. And data science truly does touch every corner of the university. And the last part of my mission statement is to ensure the responsible use of data to benefit society. So benefiting society is really tackling those very hard societal grand challenges, including climate change, healthcare, energy, social justice, and so on. I guess I'm proudest of inserting the word responsible in using data responsibly in my mission statement. This is before we knew that the Russians hacked the 2016 election and before all this Facebook brouhaha. So I'm promoting the importance of privacy and ethics throughout the university and for data science in the whole academic community, and of course industry has picked up on this as well. So I summarize this long mission statement into three words: data for good, data to do good, and using data in a good manner. And so this is what Columbia University's Data Science Institute stands for. We are truly multidisciplinary, truly collaborative, and one of the reasons I wanted to do this at Columbia was really to raise the bar on everyone in terms of research, education, and outreach at the university. And I think the DSI, the Data Science Institute, is a good vehicle to do that. So now let me take a breath. And now I wanted to turn my remarks to my time at the National Science Foundation when I was AD of SIZE. I wanted to describe the motivation behind creating this Expeditions in Computing program, which was the closest that the SIZE directorate came to offering center-scale grants to the computer science community, to the SIZE community. And I had many multiple motivations, but one was I was observing that very few proposals to the STC program were coming from the computer science community. And I surmised, except for people like Andy Van Dam and Deborah Estrin, that there were very few people who could, who had the passion and the will and the commitment and the organizational skill to actually get a group of people together and to go for a big vision and a center scale effort. It takes a lot of work, and it really does take a bold and ambitious vision. So I thought, well, maybe I could help the computer science community by warming them up. So if I do something like, you know, $10 million over 5 years instead of $25 million over 5 years, they'll kind of get used to it, and then maybe they'll be ready to propose to the STC program. So this was really quite very deliberate thinking in my mind when I created the Expeditions in Computing program. It was really to help the computing community start learning how to put big proposals together and go after big, bold visions. The other reason I created this program is at the time, so think back to 2007, 2008, the budget for NSF was not growing in the way we were all hoping it would, and that meant the community was writing more and more proposals to get the same amount of money, if you will, and when you're in that stage, you tend to be very incremental in your thinking in terms of your ambition of what you want to propose to do. You propose something that is safe so that you can, you know, you've done 2/3 of the work already, you write that proposal saying you will do what you've already done, that kind of, I mean, we've all done this game, right? So that's the kind of stuff I was seeing coming through the door, and I was saying, now, you know, I gotta give the computing community some 5 years, just propose something big, bold, and ambitious, something you really want to do, as opposed to, I really want to do this. I really want to do this. So if I empowered the community to just tell me what you want to do, I'll give you 5 years of funding and you can go and do it, I thought that was another reason I created this program. I also was watching very closely the STC program, and I have no criticism of it, but I was noticing that there was a lot of administrative overhead, you know, and for good reason, because you're getting a lot of money. So for the Expeditions program, I said, you know what, I'm going to give you your $10 million, you do great research, and we're not going to, like, look after you, you know, and ask for progress reports every quarter or every half a year or whatever. So I really wanted the money to go to the research, for the researchers to go after big, bold vision, whole is greater than the sum of the parts sort of thing, and so I created that program. And it's actually still going, so it's a nice legacy. So, but I was really deliberate in thinking the computer science community, except for the Andy Van Dams and Deborah Estrins, they weren't succeeding in the STC program. And so I thought, well, I could probably help. So I just wanted to share that story with you to see how NSF people think behind the scenes. They're really trying to help the community.
Great, thank you. Thank you all. And so I have a few questions to the panelists. Feel free to answer them, some of you or all of you. And this actually touches on something you just said, Jeanette. So in my opinion, I think in many of our opinions, the Ideal Center is more than the sum of its parts. So do you have any stories that exemplify this?
There are several ways in which my experience at SAMSI has been synergistic. What a center does is connect people, and when you connect people that should be talking to each other, you often get very surprising outcomes, and you learn a whole lot about what's going on, and you see connections that need to be made. In my field, one of the great deficiencies that I see in statistics is that we have not jumped in on the agent-based modeling world. There's virtually no theoretical foundation for how agent-based models tell us about quantified forecasts of uncertainty. It's a model, and we really don't know how to fit those models. We really don't know how to assess goodness of fit. And I regard that as a gap, and it's one of the things that we should try and fill. There's also a sense in which a center has a perhaps clearer vision of the need for curriculum reform than universities do. And so that's one of the areas in which I think centers can contribute largely. you get plugged into a whole lot of fresh projects, and the center tries to exert leadership in directions it thinks will make the fields grow and prosper. I'm not one to quibble about definitions. Data science has been bandied around a lot here in this meeting, and I never really cared to debate whether a data scientist was a statistician or a statistician was a data scientist. That stuff means nothing to me. But I do think there's a slightly different perspective that might be useful, and that is to think in terms of data engineering. A lot of the things that make our lives better, Uber, good recommender systems, weather forecasting, there's not a single theorem associated with any of these. Instead, people have taken a whole lot of data, applied some really smart algorithms, and produced something that makes our lives really much more convenient. And I would like to imagine that that could be seen as a useful contribution from the research community instead of the more traditional view of writing another theorem or discovering an extrasolar planet.
I can't resist pointing out, right, those same things are making our lives worse. But anyway, so I was inspired by the comment about begetting another center. So we didn't beget another center. We begat something through collaboration that I think is about the sum of the parts, that some people might, that had a mixed history, but at the time, so NEON. So we did, sorry, I'm going to admit it, right? Whether it's a failure or a success. When we did it, when I was engaged with NEON, right, we were doing distributed sensing, and we were brought into this National Ecological Observatory Network, which at some level had a mission and a vision statement, and I've lost all touch with it, that I still think made sense, although went in different directions. But these major research infrastructure grants are something that requires this proximity of the application and the scientists and the underlying technology. Related to that, I wanted to mention another great size AD. Jeanette, you said, now you know how NSF people think. I mean, I'm not saying anything bad about NSF, but if only we had many more of you and in the way you think. I can't believe you were only there for 3 years. Anyway, Jeanette did a remarkable amount in that 3 years. So Margaret Martinosi is the incoming size AD, and I first met her on a panel like this, and she was talking about some of her work, and she said, multidisciplinary research is about taking turns. And that was something that we really learned in the center, in that, okay, now it's the turn for the ecologist or the marine biologist or the seismologist to have their PhD student get something out of this field work, this data collection and their analysis, and that's not going to happen necessarily at the exact same time that the PhD student in computer science, electrical engineering, or statistics is doing their research. Because if you have so much uncertainty onto whether the instrument or the technique works, it's really hard for the scientist to be pursuing and having valid and robust results. And so not saying, oh, you're not going to give me an interesting research problem, so I'm not playing, could have been one of the ways that it went. But because of the STC and this thing we were committed to, the PhD students and the faculty from the technology side couldn't just walk away and say, no, you're asking me to do something that isn't interesting. And we stayed in the game, and you take turns, not over the course, with a duty cycle that keeps everybody engaged. And I think that really gives you this greater than the sum of the parts.
I will mention two topics that I think centers foster in ways that couldn't happen otherwise. And that is assisting us in understanding the science of team science. Much of interdisciplinary research these days really does require a team. And we actually have a whole protocol when we bring together a working group as to what to do to make sure that it actually works. And there's meetings called the Science of Team Science meetings that inform this. And of course, one of the very first things when you get a group of people from very different disciplinary backgrounds is just figuring out what the words are that you're using. And that's a real challenge that we find is sometimes helped through facilitation, sometimes not, but people who know better how to do this than maybe we might do in our own disciplinary area. The other thing that I think is really more than the sum of the parts is the educational initiatives. These are things that just cannot be done in the same way without a major center. And I'll give an example. Last week we had our largest undergraduate research conference. It's the Undergraduate Research Conference at Mathematics and Biology Interface. We have typically about 100 undergraduates from around the country come. And this year, one of the attendees came up to me and said, and Suzanne Lenhart, who, by the way, is my wonderful colleague who really has led these over a long time, and said, "You don't remember me." He was there as a faculty member, bringing along students, but he was an undergraduate in the very first one of these. And I think all of us have stories about our academic children, grandchildren, some people, great-grandchildren. I know that there are maybe great-great. Simon is nodding his head, yes. So those are things that centers really do help to build, that camaraderie that is across disciplines that could not happen otherwise.
If I could tag on from Lou, I want to say I totally agree with what you said, and I would also add that one of the things that centers can do that others can't is diversity in the STEM pipeline. A university department just can't achieve that.
So I would like to second that as well. I think that this is really definitely one of the unique opportunities that are created by the fact that the centers exist, that there is people that are coming and going. So one thing that I want to mention before I go into some specifics is that educational components are interesting because in some sense they are not always I wouldn't want to say stable, but they're changing. So the idea is that we are really, as we are acquiring new knowledge, there is a need to somehow disperse this knowledge, if you will, throughout the community. And very often these really are, the institutes are really the one of the ways of the devices of doing that. And this is really important because that helps with building new projects, building good team science, developing new ideas that are sort of coming out of quickly or relatively quickly understanding what is happening, how things are changing. And biology in particular, nowadays, there is really a very large number of new technologies that are coming online even faster than we can think about them. And the challenge very often is that the models that we're developing, they're kind of looking at things that were, but not necessarily at things that are. And in fact, we should be looking at things that will be. And that's a big challenge in many ways, because that's the idea of how do you do good team science that will be relevant, not just to explaining what happened, but what will happen in the future. So some of the things, for instance, that MBI has been really, really interested in over the years is this notion of, well, these biological systems, they are not just examples of some kind of compartmental models or differential equations or stochastic differential equations. They actually function as some part of a living organism, and there must be some very specific types of rules that they have to obey. Now, do we understand them? We don't, certainly. Are we able to observe them? Most of the time we don't. The data is really dirty. But nevertheless, there are some principles that these systems have to obey, otherwise they wouldn't function. So then, are we able to leverage some of these kinds of restrictions in some meaningful and mathematically meaningful way in order to be able to build better models? So, that gave rise, for instance, recently to some really, really interesting series of papers about this notion of extreme robustness of the models, for instance. And earlier on, it led to these notions of multi-scale system, which basically, again, led to building a theory of multi-scale systems for biochemical reaction networks. This was something that was developed at some point in the 60s, and then it sort of lay dormant, and then it turned out, oh, we have actually now ability with various types of technology, with single-cell technologies, with imaging. We have ability to try to build models that will sort of use this theory in order to explain biology, and in fact, we need some more. So we need to develop new ideas. So these extreme robustness models that I mentioned earlier, they are basically, this is the new theory of homeostatic systems. So that's basically really, really interesting and challenging areas within dynamical systems that people seem to be excited about. And this is an example of a discussion between a biologist and sort of dynamical systems mathematician when he's trying to understand what does it mean that the system survives in a particular way, or what is it that this biological system is supposed to do? The most important thing it does, it basically exists. Okay? And it continues to do so despite all the odds. So that's a restriction.
I thought maybe I could give two examples of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. One is from the climate agriculture science world, and the other is from the healthcare world. We have a Data Science Institute postdoc who is co-mentored by someone in Lamont Earth Observatory in the Environmental and Earth Sciences Department, and also in public policy. And this person himself is the data scientist, whatever that means. And he's been looking at the effect of how climate is changing in India, and how that will have a potentially public policy implication in terms of what India should be planting. So India right now relies very much on rice. So what he looked at is the effect of how the monsoon seasons have been changing recently. The time between each monsoon is changing, and the length of each monsoon is changing. So they're shorter, more intense rainfalls, and how all of that is going to affect crops in India. And he looked at 6 different kinds of grains, and basically he said India had better watch out, because if they're relying only on mostly rice, they're going to be in trouble. And of course, it was very data-driven. It was, a very collaborative kind of effort, and published in some prestigious journal, I can't remember. And that was just a DSI postdoc. So I like that story. Another story has to do with this huge data set, and Deborah's mention of electronic health records reminded me of this. There's a huge data set that Columbia is the coordinating center for. It's called Odyssey, ODHSI. It stands for something like observational something health in there. It has 500 million unique patient records. 500 million. And the computer scientists in the room will really appreciate the following fact. They're all in the same format. This is amazing. So it's a federated data set involving 80 different clinics in 25 countries around the world. And there's a computer science infrastructure thing behind that. But the really interesting thing is once you have 500 million patient records, it's all observational data, you can now start seeing things you cannot at all with clinical trials. And that is, of course, what they are discovering, and I won't go into that. But where I wanted to bring in, so that's the biomedical informatics department at the medical school, but they work very closely with our statistics department and our computer science department and the data science faculty in the institute. And the reason I'm bringing this up is very recently, one of our faculty members, David Bly, you probably know him, and his postdocs and graduate students came up with this approach for doing multiple causal inference. So causality, causal inference is a hot area right now. It's kind of resurged in interest. It's always been an interest in the statistics community, but I think with Judea Pearl's The Book of Why last year published, there's a resurgence of interest in the computer science community and machine learning and so on. So what they did was, well, there was this wonderful data set. And of course, in medicine, you want to know not just a correlation, you want to know if I smoke, will I get cancer sort of thing. So they now have applied this multiple causal inference technique to this big data set and compared the results of what they're getting to published medical literature and showing much better, findings than the traditional, I would say, not to insult anyone on the panel here, but traditional statistical techniques. So this is just this beautiful collaboration, coordination, spilling of ideas. That paper on the medical deconfounder, it's called, hasn't even been published yet. And it's just, this is the sort of thing that we in this kind of position can make happen, and it's very exciting.
Great, thank you. I'll ask one more question, and then I'll turn it over to all of you for your questions. So start thinking and be quick with your hand to the mic runner to catch you first if you want to ask your question. But the second one I'll ask is really about sort of some of the nitty-gritty of the functioning of a center. So what do you see as structural elements that help promote a successful center, as well as kind of constant structural challenges or things that have to be overcome in order to have a successful center?
I think centers are so different that there's no cookie-cutter answer to that question. But I will say one thing that I think would make everybody's life so much better and us all so much more productive. And that's to develop a protocol for responding to email. I get so tired of being CC'd on every little thing. And I understand the leaders of my working groups want me to know that, yes, they're out there doing their job. My staff wants me to know that they have, in fact, enrolled somebody in some special project. But I really don't need to know every little detail at that level. So I hope that as a community, we will evolve a system under which the expectations for being CC'd on email are much different. That's just a personal hobby horse. The centers, well, at SAMC, the success of a working group is critically dependent upon the working group leader and the postdoc who is involved with making things run. And I've talked to economists who talk about organizational theory. No, it's people. So it's not the structure, it's finding the right people to lead stuff off. Sadly, in the statistical and mathematical world, the set of people who have social skills that are actually useful for this type of thing, there's just not a whole lot of them out there. And so that's something that we're always struggling with for leadership in our projects. Nonetheless, when the magic works, it's great. My general sense is that in every SAMC program we run, there is going to be one working group that is sort of a dud, and one that's going to be pretty successful, and about 6 to 8 will be fine. So that's something I haven't figured out how to improve, but that's what I've seen in the past. The one other thing I was going to say that's something that has really surprised me about being SAMC director is it suddenly matters what time I get to work in the morning. Before I was a director, nobody cared what time I showed up. As long as I was teaching my classes, all was good. But now I've got staff, and so I have to be there at 9 o'clock in the morning, or else I'm setting the wrong example. And if I get there earlier, then the staff takes that as a signal that they're supposed to get there early. If I get there late, that's permission to come late. It's just terrible.
So I have one good thing that will be unpopular that I'm saying, one thing that I found problematic, and one thing that I wish had been there. So the good thing, and nobody likes me to say this, is that I found the annual site visits important and useful. Nobody wants me to say it, right? Because it's a lot of work. But it kept us focused. It kept us on mission. It was the course correction. Everyone's going off on their own internal, with integrity, what they think is the right thing to do. And it gave us, sorry guys, we have to get together and, bring our story together. So I'm sticking with that. The thing that was a little more difficult, right? We all know that, static allocations of resources are not as good as other things, but when you go into a center, you statically allocate across the institutions that are a part of it. And it's this point of rigidity in how adaptive you are as you move things along. It's just weird. And it got in our way to some extent. We were very adaptive as things happened and things changed. But that point always stuck there, that these were now I had a small number of institutions. We were pretty tight geographically and otherwise. It all worked out. But that was an oddity that I think if you have a larger number of institutions, it probably forces to this very bimodal thing where you have one central institution with most of the money and then lots of little ones, because then that static division of resources doesn't matter as much. But we weren't done that way. As my colleagues at USC told me many times, they were in the optimal position. They got the most amount of, after UCLA being the center, USC got the most amount of money and had to do none of the administrative, education, diversity, et cetera, work. And then the thing that I wish had happened, and maybe it's not feasible, but I said this to NSF multiple times, is that there were opportunities for us to engage with other federal agencies, from USDA to other ones, and I couldn't get any facilitation there. And I think that, we were doing research, and there were agencies that weren't necessarily used to research, and that was a missed opportunity, and would suggest that it's something to be explored.
So I'll mention a couple things. One is that I never feel that I need to be there at 9 a.m. I really feel that building a staff that you trust to do what needs to be done is key. And I've been very lucky. I've had a staff that has essentially stayed with me the entire time. It's been a very family-friendly group. In fact, I insisted to our administration that we had to have a way to allow those who had, as they put it, medical need, come with someone to do childcare with them. And I fought that battle, and we were successful at doing it. So staff that you trust, I feel that the way to think about this, you trust your staff until trust is broken, and hopefully trust is not broken. Another key point with regard to organizational aspects is the advisory board being really clear up front with what it is that you are expecting that board to do is absolutely critical. We had a working board, and we told everyone that they were going to be a working board, and that meant that some people were basically asked to leave the board early because they weren't doing any work. Don't like to do that. And of course, in a very interdisciplinary center, that means choosing the advisory board to represent the broad array of activities. In this case, the board actually worked to vet proposals to us. Actually, not proposals. They're requests for support. I learned NSF doesn't like the term. Another thing is connections to other agencies. So NIMBIOS was started as a collaborative between the NSF, Homeland Security, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And NSF worked very hard to make sure that I supposedly didn't know what money was coming from where. I did, of course, but it fell apart after a few years. And that was not anything to do with what we did, but because of the agencies involved. So being flexible about that and being sure that you tie into whatever appropriate agency is. And the final thing I'll mention is that I really think it's important for centers to be very aware of what's going on at the home institution where they're based. Centers have a longer lifespan than most administrations. I'm now reporting to the 8th Vice Chancellor for Research in the 12 years that NIMBIOS has existed. And it's also the 5th President, 4th Provost, 5th Chancellor. In every case, I made sure that everyone in those positions knew what we were about. And if I hadn't, I'm afraid there would have been problems.
So I must agree with most of the things that were said already here. I would like to mention one thing that I believe was not, and that is the location. It really is important where is your institute located in terms of physical location. MBI started as an institute that was originally housed in the mathematics department in the same building. What it did originally, it has created tremendous, at least at the beginning, engagement engagement on the part of the members of the math department who were sort of interested in the general topics. But it didn't necessarily translate into the, say biologists and others participating in more programs. However, once MBI moved to a different location, it changed somewhat in the sense that it became more accessible, and somehow the general pattern of participation, if you will, across the university faculty changed. And that is interesting, and I believe that it really is important to have an institute which is sort of anchored in the right environment, in the right place, both physically and sort of course, intellectually as well. But here I'm specifically talking about the physical location. I think it makes really a big difference. The topology of the typical university campus is very funny. We might not meet people that basically work right across the hallway from us, except at some conference in some exotic country, occasionally. And that is very often a problem, in the sense that, we had more opportunities to interact. It might have been possible to actually start working on certain things together. But without this anchoring, it's really difficult to do. So generally, I think it's really important. The other thing I want to also mention is staff, but not just in terms of sort of the competency, but also sort of staff has to understand the mission. What is it that this institute is really supposed to be doing? Why are they here? This is not a department. This is not, some kind of specific unit within the university that was developed for the sort of internal consumption. It's a national institute or international institute in many ways. And the understanding this, I think, really helps with lots of issues related to some logistics about what things are important that need to be discussed right away, which things can wait, which things never have to go to the director's email inbox. So I think that this really is important in many ways, beyond just being bothered with an overflow of various information, because it also creates for the people who are incoming, for the visitors in particular, both to the workshops and the long-term visitors, the sense that they are kind of at home. They're coming in and they are in this environment when everybody knows what they are doing, why they are here. This really, at least in my experience, has been a very, very important aspect of making sure that people are welcome. So if someone starts in the middle of a hallway writing something on the whiteboard, the staffer is not going to tell him, "Excuse me, we just cleaned that." It's for the next workshop. I mean, they're kind of understanding that these people who are coming in and they also have a mission. So I think this really makes for a very good working environment. And MBI was very fortunate in the sense that virtually all of the people who started in 2002 stayed up until now. So it's very, very low turnover. For those of you who are familiar with Ohio State, you know that this is very unusual for an academic and non-academic unit. But nevertheless, it also means that people sort of who worked there understood the mission and felt very comfortable about it.
I'd like to mention 4 ingredients that I think make a center successful, and then 2 things that are challenges. So the 4 ingredients: first, it takes a really good leader. Whoever is the director of the center is not only providing the research vision, but the organizational prowess. Now, sometimes you don't have all of that in one person, so then you need the chief technical scientist type of person and the executive director to do all the hard work. But it takes a good leader or leadership team. Second is staff. I am blessed with a phenomenal staff at the Data Science Institute at Columbia. I've been at many organizations before, and I really feel I have this incredible team around me. They pull for each other. It's a very lean and mean staff, but phenomenal. But I also mean not just administrative staff, but technical staff. And Deborah mentioned there were some number of research scientists. I'm sure that a large success of her center was due to their 100% dedication to just that center. And I also mean technical staff of the software engineers who actually build things and make sure things run. Centers can hire them if they have enough money to do so, and these are the people who really keep things going. The third ingredient is money. So with money, you can do something. And money also attracts people. It's just human nature. If there were no money, then people will find other things to do with their time. And the fourth is space. And I very much agree with what you said about where the center is located. I wish I had that ability to be kind of this in a neutral location right now. But another thing I wanted to make mention of is something that the National Science Foundation learned after the ITR program. Does anyone remember the ITR? Okay, well, some of you do. Okay, they did it was actually Sarah Kiesler, so some of you might know her, did a study of what were the factors of success for the ITR program. And one of the factoids that I remember in that paper she wrote was that proximity to collaborators was important. So at one point, NSF, and I think NSF still does it, they want multiple institutions around the country, and, because you want as much participation, you want to spread the wealth, all that kind of stuff. But Sarah's paper, after looking at ITR, said, what really fosters the most successful collaborations is when you're right next door to each other, or you don't have a long walk and actually it's covered so that you don't have to go in the rain. And so I think NSF actually sat up after that paper and started thinking, well, when we look to fund big efforts, proximity is actually quite important. Now, the 2 points I wanted to make with respect to challenges. When you're running a center or an institute, especially one that crosses departments and schools across the university, there's a tension for that faculty member who's part of your center. Where do I spend my time? With the department or school or with the center? Or how am I supposed to divide my time? And the center wants me to do this, but I already do all this other stuff for the department, for the school, for the university. I can only do so many things. And so the center, the institute, wants that faculty's time and energy and brain power, but so does the department and the school that the faculty resides in. And who gives tenure to that person? Not the center, not the institute. So that's the tension. And the second challenge is, of course, which was already mentioned, and something that NSF reminds all new center directors and so on, is that you're not going to be around forever. We can only fund you for so long. It's up to you to figure out your sustainability plan. And that is probably what keeps a lot of center directors up at night. How am I going, and DIMAC's incredible run of 30 years. You should be, I don't know what you did, but whatever you did must be a formula of success. And I wish you another at least 30 more years of success. But that is usually, in the back of the mind of any center director. So that's
Great. Thank you. And thanks for the kind words about DIMACs. Let's open it up for your questions from the audience.
So I could go on and on. Everything you said resonated. I also don't have to feel after 30 years I have to show up. I couldn't run a center if I had to get up that early. But
Does his staff, by the way.
we'll deal with that later. But there's one thing I haven't heard at all yet. So a lot of the problems that we're talking about, that you need multidisciplinarity to approach and so on, climate change, epidemics, cybersecurity, they not only cross disciplines, but they cross international boundaries. And so modern centers, not all of them, but modern centers have to at least think about having an international component. So what are the difficulties of international collaborations through a center, and how do you pull it off to be able to address these big problems?
Well, SEMSI tries to partner with lots of international research groups, the Newton Institute, Turing Institute, Lorentz Center, BERS. That's a starting point.
And I'll just say that if you have money to bring people in, Zoom and other modern tools have been phenomenal. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been driving in the car, talking on the phone to someone in somewhere, two or three people in Europe and people across the U.S., all at the same time talking about a research problem. I think Zoom has made it feasible without a lot, Zoom and the other tools like it have made it feasible to really enhance those collaborations. As far as money goes from another institution, there are, of course, a variety of NSF joint enterprises with other countries. I don't know that any of them have supported anything like center scale activities, but you can, as you know, you can apply for anything.
We found that interacting with another similarly sized center of some sort internationally worked, and then we would send students back and forth but send no money. So we would just keep paying our students who would spend time at EPFL. EPFL would send us students, they'd keep paying them. And, but it didn't happen with individuals and one-off, it happened at institution level.
So my experience is that the issues with Zoom are that these are very good opportunities for initial discussions, or potentially for having discussions once certain types of projects have been already initiated. But very often there is really a need for sort of face-to-face conversations in order to be able to start or seed certain type of activity. So MBI has had a variety of different approaches to this, but we have heavily used BERS, as well as, Oberwolfach, for instance, the sort of European center, and that's one of those places where it's possible to organize international conference, not necessarily using US funds. But we have also had a number of conferences that we have organized in the countries that were relatively inexpensive and easy to get to for a variety of people. And this was sort of understood, and that the funding was always very tricky for these types of events, but most of the time it would simply mean that the US, that the part would be supporting the US scientists, and then another entity would be helping with the resources for others. One thing that I did not mention, which is also relevant to the general mission of the Institute in the context of postdoctoral training, is that MBI has developed over the years, it started with the first founding director and then continued, a very large number of so-called, we called it institutional partners, which basically meant that there were some entities across the world that were committed to investing certain amount of resources into interactions with MBI. And in exchange, they were given a break in various ways, for instance, in some of the costs of participating in the activities at the Institute, and there were various other ways in which we were able to interact with them. For instance, some of the postdoctoral fellows were working on projects that were suggested by these other entities. But the point was that there were some resources that were sort of outside of the regular NSF and other types of general funding for the Institute that were available for these types of international exchange.
I wanted to make mention of international collaborations by necessity. If you think about, and again, I'm putting my NSF hat on, if you think about large scientific instruments like the Large Hadron Collider or these large telescopes in Chile and so on, they are one of very expensive instruments that usually are funded through a collaboration of multiple government agencies coming together and saying, we need to build this together, and all the scientists can participate. And those are incredible collaborations, very complex organizationally, and I do know that the American Academy of Arts and Sciences is looking into this very topic, Fred, as times have changed recently in terms of international cooperation and collaboration, even in the sciences, as it's been difficult, for instance, for certain people to get visas. And so this is, we don't want politics to stand in the way of advancing science, but times have changed. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, and Paul, I think you have the other mic, and that'll be our last question.
Yeah, in a sense, all of you have touched on this. I'm a great believer that being in the office next door really is a huge help. But it seems to me that more and more people at universities say, thank goodness I don't have to go to work. I can do it all from home, especially in mathematics, in computer sciences. So is the nature of the way people work with each other changing enough to accommodate that?
Well, Paul, if I can take a stab at that. There was a study at Bell Labs, which was very much like the one that was mentioned earlier, that found that people who were on the same hall were much more likely to co-author together than people who were on different floors. And it seems that little barriers make a huge difference, and I totally agree with that. I would also say that, to my surprise, the Berkeley Math Department basically works from home. And anybody who's been to Evans Hall knows why, because Evans Hall is just, yes.
Well, but do they work? Do they collaborate with each other?
There was a time when the Berkeley Math and Stats groups worked in dyads, and they're famous pairs of people who collaborate, Bickel and Doxum, Hodges and Lehman. I mean,
But now?
Not so much. And so maybe things are changing, as Paul says. I will add one thing that tags off of what Greg mentioned earlier in this connection with this. In my experience, the first meeting on a project has to be face-to-face and in person. And if that goes well, then you can go off and work remotely with Zoom or other techniques, but the first one has to be face-to-face.
And I'm going to add that our experience with working groups is it's not sufficient to have a first meeting face-to-face. That real success comes about in a combination of planned face-to-face meetings in addition to a regular set of, often these are subgroups who take on particular sub-projects, and that one is not enough.
I agree.
You know, my image of mathematicians is lots of people hovering over a blackboard, Right. So you're ruining my image of the mathematician's work. I know, that's old-fashioned.
So let me just say that in many of these environments, when you were doing math plus X, meaning that you are really looking at the scientists that are sort of outside of mathematics, it is important to be able to ask that person questions sort of in a fashion that's comfortable and leisurely and then gives you time to sort of process what the other people are saying. So I think that there is something definitely that team science needs in terms of face-to-face contact. On the other hand, I am a firm believer in Zoom and other technology. This has become now sort of a standard.
This workshop was sponsored by Zoom.
Don't take it personally, former Microsoft person.
All right. Well, thank you to our panelists for an excellent conversation and for you guys for participating. Before we do the round of applause for that, I want to welcome you to please join us for a reception that will be taking place immediately now, or almost immediately now. And then there's also the conference banquet, and I assume there's somewhere that we will find banquet back where we were, reception maybe out here. And that will include a presentation by Joan Feigenbaum at the banquet. So with that, I think thanks to all the speakers for today, and especially thanks to our panelists.